Today we're going to talk about one of my personal favorite Super Nintendo add-ons, the Super Game Boy. Now why is this thing so awesome? Because it's a Game Boy, but super. So what exactly does a Super Game Boy do? Well, it lets you play your Game Boy games on a TV. Yeah, your Super Nintendo becomes a Super Game Boy. Now it's Ultimate Game Boy. Well, actually no, it's just Super. I guess now you're not just playing with portable power, I guess you're playing with super portable power. Sometimes specific Game Boy cartridges would have a Super Game Boy logo on it, which meant it was a Super Game Boy pack, but pretty much any single Game Boy game could be played on the Super Game Boy as long as it's not the Game Boy Color. So pretty much, you take your Game Boy game, put it in your Super Game Boy, and then you stick this thing in your Super Nintendo, and now you got super portable power. So here you got your Super Game Boy and the Super logo. It's like a normal Game Boy, but super. And some of the borders will change sometimes, depending on which game you play. Like normal Game Boy games, the borders don't change, but when it's like a Super Game Boy game, the borders change into something related to the game. Another cool thing about the Super Game Boy is that, like, for example, Street Fighter on the Game Boy, the border will change to whatever stage you are from the normal Street Fighter game. So it's like you're playing the Super Nintendo game, but with bad controls. An interesting note about Space Invaders is that it includes the Super Nintendo game on the Game Boy version, which is pretty weird because it kind of makes you wonder, how did they do that? Though they did take away the multiplayer. One of the cooler things about the Super Game Boy is that if you press L and R, you can bring up a menu which lets you mess around with the colors. You get a wide assortment of different options to choose from. You can mess around with the borders. Now if the game has a special border, this little face will be happy. You can go from boring nothing, some weird window room, this rock looking thing, being outside with a cabin in the woods, some pencils, bunch of kitty cats, some weird artsy fartsy loopy thing. My personal favorite of the borders is you can draw your own, and then you can just play with that border, whatever else you want to draw. You can mess around with the colors. Now I guess you can play with real pink Kirby by messing around with the colors. So basically the Super Game Boy was just a Game Boy, but for your Super Nintendo, and now instead of just playing normal colorless Game Boy games, you could play with special borders on some games, and there was color added, and basically it was just the Super Game Boy.